Savannah, Georgia, June 14th, 1846. The kitchen was alive with the smells of roasted fowl, sugared cakes, and simmering wine. Silver platters gleamed under candlelight as laughter spilled from the parlor into the hall. But behind the swinging doors, a single pair of hands stirred something darker into the feast. On that wedding night in Savannah, the air carried more than celebration. It carried death. What the guests did not know, as they raised their glasses and offered toasts to love, was that revenge had already been served. Sweetness masked bitterness, sugar cloaked venom. A woman who had been silenced her entire life chose that night to speak in the only language left to her, and when dawn broke, the family's laughter was gone forever. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where we walk together through history's shadows, unearthing the stories whispered about but rarely told. Tonight, we open the case of Sarah of Savannah, the enslaved cook who turned a wedding feast into a reckoning. But I must ask you, do you have the courage to hear what really happened in those candlelit rooms? Subscribe now and tell us where you're watching from, because to join this investigation, you must be willing to follow the trail of poison, grief, and vengeance wherever it leads. Now, you have to understand Savannah in the mid-1800s. The air was thick with salt from the river. Cloying humidity clung to every breath, and the streets were framed by moss-draped oaks that seemed to whisper secrets overhead. Mansions with grand pillars rose proudly along squares, their facades masking the misery sustained by enslaved labor. To the outside world, Savannah was a jewel of the South, a place of gentility and prosperity. But beneath that veneer pulsed a darker current, one built on human bondage and daily cruelty. If you closed your eyes then, you'd hear the carriage wheels on cobblestones, but you'd also hear the shuffle of chains, the muffled sobs behind servant doors. This was the world in which Sarah lived, cooked, and plotted. The family Sarah served was not nameless, faceless gentry. They were pillars of Savannah society, landowners, church patrons, their names etched into courthouse records. At the head was Judge Whitmore, a man admired for his wisdom in law, but whispered about for the lash he carried like an extension of his hand. His wife, Eleanor, presided over the home with cold elegance, her smile reserved for guests, never for servants. Their son, Thomas, the groom-to-be, was celebrated as a charming young man, though those beneath the household knew his laughter often followed cruelty. On the surface, they were hosts of a grand wedding. In the shadows, they were tormentors whose sins had long gone unanswered. Publicly, the Whitmores were known as a family of refinement and Christian virtue. Their neighbors saw charity banquets, Sunday pews filled, and holiday tables extended to guests of honor. The cover story was simple. They embodied Southern grace. Behind those ornate parlor curtains, however, the reality was more sinister. Food was plentiful for visitors, but servants were beaten for crumbs. Scripture was recited in drawing rooms while whips cracked in the fields. This contradiction was not just accepted, it was celebrated as tradition, and it is within this lie that Sarah's opportunity to act was born. You see, Sarah was not merely a cook. She was the very backbone of the Whitmore household's illusion of civility. The kitchen, hot, smoky, and humming with activity, was her domain. Every meal that graced the Whitmore table passed through her hands. That access was power, though few recognized it. Day after day, Sarah chopped, stirred, and baked under watchful eyes. But the pantry also held bottles of laudanum, jars of arsenic-laced rat poison, and bitter herbs considered remedies. In a society that gave her no voice, these ingredients were silent conspirators waiting to be summoned. The family's trust in their cook became the blade they never saw descending. Of course, when sicknesses struck plantations, when children died suddenly, or masters fell inexplicably ill, doctors offered familiar excuses. Malaria, they'd say. Spoiled meat, perhaps, or God's will. These explanations reassured the gentry, allowing them to ignore the obvious, that those forced to serve them might harbor motives far sharper than knives. Poison was the invisible weapon of the powerless, but few dared whisper it. After all, to even suggest it would mean admitting vulnerability, and the Whitmores, like so many others, preferred their illusions intact. Every story like this has an accomplice, witting or unwitting. In Sarah's case, it was the butler, Henry. Older, graying, and weary, Henry had long since learned the art of survival. Never speak too loudly, never look too long, never question the master. He kept the wine stocked, the table polished, and the guests entertained. Yet it was Henry who noticed Sarah's unusual calm in the frantic days leading to the wedding. Did he suspect? Perhaps. But complicity often wears the mask of silence, and silence, in that house, was the only protection he knew. Now, I want you to picture this. The wedding guests, dressed in silks and linens, their jewels catching the candlelight. The Whitmores, radiant in their smugness, basking in the glow of their wealth. The young bride, wide-eyed, stepping into a family she did not yet understand. These were not just victims of circumstance. They were participants in a brutal system that crushed others so their world could glitter. And it was precisely this glittering veneer that Sarah chose to shatter, using the only weapon left to her. But every act of vengeance requires someone to notice, to stumble into the truth before it's too late. In this story, it was a housemaid named Lila, barely 16, nimble on her feet, carrying trays with nervous energy. Lila adored Sarah, often stealing moments in the kitchen to watch her work. On that fateful day, she noticed Sarah's deliberate movements, the careful addition of a powder she had never seen before. Confused, perhaps frightened, Lila said nothing. But in silence, she became a witness, one whose memory would haunt her long after the screams of that night faded. When the first cries erupted in the Whitmore dining hall, Lila froze. Plates clattered to the floor, silverware scattered, and laughter twisted into choking gasps. Guests clutched their stomachs, their faces pale beneath the glow of candlelight. Lila saw Sarah's eyes then, calm, steady, almost resigned, but no one else noticed. As the chaos spread, doctors were summoned, prayers whispered, and rumors flickered like wildfire: spoiled food, heat stroke, divine punishment. For Lila, the truth burned in her chest, unspoken. She knew what she'd seen in the kitchen, yet when she tried to whisper it to Henry, he shook his head violently. No, child, you saw nothing. Denial was their only shield. Speaking aloud what had really happened could mean a noose for them all. The Whitmore estate became a hive of officials within days. Physicians inspected the bodies, clergy performed hurried rites, and city magistrates whispered behind closed doors. But the investigation was little more than performance. Poison was too scandalous an accusation. It implied vulnerability among the powerful. Instead, the conclusion was drawn neatly. A bad batch of food, perhaps tainted by summer rot. The household staff were questioned, yes, but only superficially. Sarah stood before them, eyes lowered, hands folded. No direct accusation was made, no evidence presented. The system had no interest in truth. It had every interest in preserving Savannah's fragile illusion of order. And so the official story became one of tragic accident, filed away with bureaucratic indifference. Yet not everyone died. Some guests lingered in bed for weeks, racked with fevers, their bodies weakened beyond repair. One of Thomas's closest friends, a young officer, survived but was never the same. His hair fell out in clumps, his hands shook uncontrollably. The bride herself endured agonizing nights, her once bright eyes clouded, her laughter replaced by a haunted silence. These survivors were living proof that something unnatural had occurred. Still, society explained them away. Delicate constitutions, ill luck. No one dared connect the suffering to the smiling woman still serving quietly in the kitchen. To do so would unravel far more than one family's tragedy. It would threaten the entire hierarchy that held Savannah together. Now, you have to understand, Sarah's act was not rash. It was calculated, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise. In the pantry, she had access to arsenic labeled for vermin control. She understood its bitter taste could be masked by sugar, its chalky residue hidden in custards, cakes, and sauces. To the guests, the sweetness of celebration drowned out every trace of bitterness. The dosages were measured, not enough to be obvious at first bite, but sufficient to spread agony through the night. This was not madness, nor mere impulse. It was a science of vengeance born from years of observation in the kitchen laboratory. Sarah had watched, learned, and waited. On the day of the Whitmore wedding, her experiment was complete. Every story like this demands a figure reckless enough to seek the truth. In Sarah's tale, that figure was not a wealthy neighbor or a magistrate, but a free black preacher named Josiah Green. Born in Savannah, yet educated in the North, Josiah returned with fire in his voice and suspicion in his heart. He had heard whispers about the Whitmore tragedy. Too many deaths, too much silence, too neat an explanation. And unlike the city officials, Josiah had little to lose by digging deeper. Flawed, yes, he was known to drink too much, to argue too loudly, but his defiance made him dangerous to the polite fictions Savannah clung to. And when he began asking questions about Sarah, people lowered their voices, shuffled their feet, and told him, best leave it be, which of course he did not. Josiah's method was simple. He listened. He lingered near the markets where enslaved cooks traded gossip. He slipped coins into the palms of stable boys, and he pressed the trembling Lila for her memory of that night. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. Sarah, serene in the kitchen, powders folded into sweet custard, a silence too heavy to be innocence. Josiah visited the Whitmore estate under the guise of prayer, his eyes scanning shelves of remedies and rat poison bottles. He found none of it conclusive. But he found something better, fear. Fear among the servants who spoke her name only in whispers, fear among neighbors who avoided the subject entirely, and fear, most tellingly, in the Whitmore survivors themselves, who bristled whenever her name arose. Fear, Josiah reasoned, was the surest sign of guilt concealed. Now, I have to stop and ask you directly, can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling. We've seen Sarah's vengeance, yes, but the deeper truth is not simply that she acted. It is how she managed to outwit a society designed to crush her. Imagine for a moment you're in Josiah's shoes, standing at the edge of a revelation so dangerous it could unravel Savannah's facade entirely. Would you press on, knowing the consequences, or would you step back into silence, like so many others did? Think about it carefully, because from here, the path only grows darker. Josiah's persistence finally bore fruit one sweltering evening, when the humidity clung to the air like a damp shroud, and the gas lamps along Savannah's streets flickered as though burdened by the weight of secrets. Henry, the butler who had served the Whitmores for more years than anyone could recall, broke beneath the strain of silence he had carried since that wedding night. His shoulders sagged, his voice cracked, and in the safety of Josiah's presence, words spilled from him like a confession pulled from the soul. He admitted that he had seen Sarah with his own eyes, tucked away in the pantry as the rest of the house buzzed with preparations. She had been steady, deliberate, transferring a pale powder into jars destined for sauces and custards. Henry described the sight with a trembling hand pressed to his temple, the faint dust rising from the jar, catching the candlelight like motes of ash, the rhythmic way Sarah stirred, unhurried, almost meditative. And then came the detail that unsettled Josiah most. Henry recalled how Sarah hummed softly as she worked, not a nervous tune, not a distracted murmur, but the low, steady cadence of a hymn, the kind sung in prayer circles on starlit nights. She knew what she was doing, Henry whispered, his voice so thin, Josiah had to lean forward to catch the words. His hands shook, not from age this time, but from the memory of knowing and never speaking. For Josiah, this was not physical proof, no vial, no residue, no traceable evidence. But it was something more valuable, testimony from the man who had built his life around keeping the Whitmore family's secrets safe. If Henry, loyal and cautious to the point of self-preservation, admitted Sarah's guilt, it was as damning as any signed confession. It was enough to pierce the illusion that the Whitmores had died from misfortune, enough to confirm the whispers Josiah had been chasing through markets and kitchens. Yet even as he held this fragile truth, Josiah felt the weight of futility pressing down. Evidence without action was nothing more than another secret waiting to be buried beneath Savannah's cobblestones, another echo destined to fade unless someone dared to amplify it. Word of Josiah's questions traveled faster than he could have anticipated, whispered first in the kitchens, then in parlors, and finally carried into the ears of men who had no interest in old tragedies being re-examined. With the gossip came danger, subtle at first. A sudden hush when he entered a room, merchants who once greeted him turning their backs, the eerie sensation of eyes tracking him as he walked through Savannah's squares. And then came the night when danger revealed its face. Josiah had been at a tavern near the docks, pressing for scraps of information between sips of watered ale, when he noticed two men rise as he made for the door. At first, he thought little of it, but as he entered the alley that curled toward the river, their footsteps matched his, deliberate, heavy, each strike of boot against cobblestone echoing louder in his ears than the church bells of midnight. The gas lamps along the lane threw long, distorted shadows. The men followed in silence until one muttered a curse, low and venomous, confirming what Josiah already feared. This was no coincidence. His breath quickened, his heart thudding against his ribs, as if urging him to flee. He quickened his stride, the damp air clinging to his skin, the stench of brackish water rising with the tide. Then, without warning, Josiah turned sharply into a side street, a narrow passage swallowed in thick river fog. The men shouted behind him, their voices cutting through the mist, fists striking brick walls in frustration as they lost sight of him. Josiah pressed forward, lungs burning, legs trembling, until he found the small wooden doors of a hidden chapel, half sunken into the shadows. He slipped inside, closing the door softly, pressing his forehead to the cool wood as sweat streamed down his temples. In that silence, broken only by his ragged breath, the realization struck him with terrifying clarity. This was no idle intimidation. Someone wanted him silenced. Someone with enough influence to hire shadows to stalk him through the city's veins. Sarah's vengeance, he now understood, had not merely unsettled a single family. It had fractured a delicate facade of power. The truth he pursued was dangerous enough to demand blood in exchange for its burial. Shaken, but far from broken, Josiah carried his fragile discoveries into the only circles where he believed truth might still matter. The city's modest community of free blacks, artisans, preachers, and a handful of sympathetic abolitionists who operated at the very edge of danger. In a dimly lit back room of a boarding house, he laid out the fragments of his investigation like sacred relics. Henry's trembling testimony, Lila's haunted memory of powders stirred into jars, the lingering illnesses of the survivors whose bodies carried the scars of something far more sinister than spoiled food. His voice trembled at first, but soon it carried the weight of conviction, urging them to see what was plain before their eyes. Yet instead of the rally he hoped for, the room answered with silence, followed by nervous murmurs. One elder finally broke it, leaning forward with eyes hardened by years of survival. If you accuse a white family preacher, you sign your own death warrant, and maybe ours as well. Others nodded grimly, their faces etched with fear. Even within the church, where Josiah expected to find sanctuary, the whispers turned against him. Congregants muttered that his sermons had grown reckless, that his obsession with Sarah's story threatened to draw unwanted attention upon them all. Some even suggested he had invented the details to stir unrest. The reversal struck Josiah like a blow to the chest. Here he was, clutching truth like a burning coal, only to find that those he sought to protect recoiled from it, terrified of being consumed by the flames. He realized then the cruelest twist of Sarah's revenge. Her act had been forged in silence, carried out beneath the watchful eyes of a household blind to the power of the woman in their kitchen. And now, even in death, or perhaps in disappearance, her story was destined to remain smothered in that same silence, unless, of course, someone was willing to risk everything to drag it screaming into the light. For Josiah, the choice was becoming clear. The question was whether he possessed the strength to bear the cost. It took months of uneasy silence before the Whitmore estate finally drew more whispers than Savannah's society could safely contain. At first, officials had tried to ignore the rumors, servants passing stories in the marketplace, neighbors lowering their voices when the Whitmore name was mentioned, guests who survived the wedding carrying strange afflictions that could no longer be explained away as ill luck. But as gossip seeped beyond kitchen doors and into drawing rooms, As visitors began to hesitate before attending gatherings in the very same neighborhood, the city's veneer of elegance threatened to crack. Something had to be done, not out of a pursuit for justice, but to preserve appearances. And so, an official raid was staged. Magistrates and inspectors arrived at the Whitmore mansion under the banner of law, but in truth, their mission was to smother suspicion, to tidy the mess before Savannah's reputation suffered. When they entered the kitchen, however, what they found unsettled even them. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and spice, the lingering ghosts of meals once prepared. Shelves lined with jars glimmered in the dim light, some labeled for pests or remedies, others unmarked entirely. Bottles of laudanum, small packets of powders, bundles of dried herbs tied neatly with string, an inventory that, to the trained eye, could be innocent or sinister depending on the narrative chosen. To the outsiders who stepped cautiously across those stone floors, it looked less like a kitchen and more like an apothecary of shadows, a chamber of horrors where life and death had been measured out in spoonfuls. And yet, for Sarah, it had always been nothing more than her workplace, her domain, the pantry where she had labored daily under the Whitmore gaze. No vial screamed poison. No jar bore a skull and crossbones. No smoking gun emerged from the shelves. But the suggestion was enough. The investigators, their palms damp, could no longer entirely dismiss the whispers. For the first time, they were forced to confront a truth they had long denied, that the greatest danger to Savannah's social order did not lurk in foreign invaders or abolitionist pamphlets. It simmered quietly in their kitchens, in the hands of those they believed powerless. Rebellion measured out grain by grain within their very homes. When the Whitmore family's cruelty finally seeped into daylight, it was not through the grand proclamations of courtrooms or the solemn verdicts of magistrates, but through the quiet, stubborn persistence of whispers. Those who had lived in the family's shadow, servants, neighbors, field hands, began to trade memories once spoken only in confidence. Eleanor, with her sharp tongue that could cut deeper than any blade, had humiliated maids in front of guests for the slightest misstep. Thomas, the heir groomed for social prominence, was remembered less for charm and more for his drunken rages, the way he staggered through the estate with fists clenched, leaving bruises that never reached official notice. And Judge Whitmore, the patriarch himself, was a figure of chilling authority, his punishments not just swift, but relentless, carried out with the cold satisfaction of a man convinced that cruelty was the same as order. Sarah's act, carried out with the precision of a surgeon and the quiet patience of someone who had endured too much for too long, had done more than end their lives. It had unmasked them. In the eyes of the community they ruled, the Whitmores' polished reputation, carved from wealth, law, and lineage, crumbled like plaster under rain. The wedding, carefully staged to symbolize continuity, power, and legacy, became the very night their hypocrisy was laid bare. Every toast, every dance, every golden promise of the evening dissolved into the bitter aftertaste of poison. And yet, when quills scratched across parchment in city offices, the official record told a different story. There, the Whitmores' names remained polished and untarnished, memorialized as victims of a tragic misfortune, martyrs of fate rather than architects of their own undoing. Their cruelty was never acknowledged in ink. It was erased, buried, replaced with euphemism. But memory is stubborn, and memory belongs to the people. Among the enslaved who cooked their meals, the servants who bore their insults, the free black community who watched from the margins, the truth endured. In their oral stories, passed from mouth to ear under cover of night, the Whitmores were remembered not as noble victims, but as architects of their own destruction, undone by the very woman they had sought to keep voiceless. What is most chilling, perhaps, is realizing that Sarah's act was not a singular, isolated eruption of vengeance, a lightning bolt striking out of nowhere, but rather part of a much older, much broader pattern that haunted the slaveholding world like an unshakable ghost. Across the American South, from the rice plantations of Charleston to the sprawling sugar estates of New Orleans, Hushed stories circulated with unnerving frequency. Masters who fell mysteriously ill, their bodies racked with fevers that no physician could cure. Entire households struck down during feasts, their laughter dissolving into groans of pain as they clutched their stomachs. Lingering ailments that weakened proud patriarchs and left heirs too fragile to inherit the legacies built on suffering. These were not the kind of tales committed to the polished surface of history books. They traveled instead in whispers, in warnings, in late-night confessions exchanged between enslaved people in quarters dimly lit by firelight. They functioned both as ghost stories and as parables of possibility, cautionary tales for oppressors, quiet inspiration for the oppressed. And the pattern stretched far beyond the American South. In the Caribbean, where rebellion flared openly and often, stories of overseers poisoned by rum or stew became part of the cultural memory of survival itself. In Brazil, enslaved women were said to stir deadly tinctures into the very coffee their masters drank at dawn, sending retribution straight past the lips of men who believed themselves untouchable. These were acts not of madness, but of strategy, forms of warfare fought with the tools available. The kitchen, after all, was the most overlooked battlefield of them all. Here, cooks stood at the precise crossroads of nourishment and destruction, wielding spoons and knives with an intimacy no overseer could monitor. Sugar could disguise bitterness, sauces could conceal venom, a rich stew could deliver not only comfort but calamity. Rage, when denied every other outlet, could be measured, ground, distilled, and folded carefully into a recipe until it became something fatal. And unlike open rebellion, crushed with chains, guns, and gallows, this kind of resistance was invisible, deniable, impossible to trace with certainty. Sarah, then, was not merely a solitary avenger. She was a thread woven into a far wider tapestry of defiance, a hidden network of knowledge and desperation that stretched across continents. Few of these stories ever survive in official archives. They were too dangerous to admit, too disruptive to the fragile narrative of control. But within enslaved communities themselves, the truth was deeply understood. To cook was to serve, yes, but it was also to hold the quiet power of life and death, meal by meal, feast by feast. Savannah's tragedy was no aberration. It was a glimpse, fleeting yet unmistakable, into a shadow war waged silently across tables and kitchens, a war history has rarely dared to name aloud. Let's be real. Society could not, and would not, afford to acknowledge this hidden war. To admit it would have meant dismantling the very myth on which slavery was built, the fragile illusion that the enslaved were docile, that they accepted their bondage with passivity, that their labor was freely given rather than violently stolen. To concede that enslaved people resisted not only with their bodies, but with their intellect, their creativity, and their cunning would have unraveled the entire justification for the system. Sarah's act, if it had been recognized for what it truly was, would have exposed the truth, that beneath the carefully maintained surface lay a smoldering intelligence, a capacity for strategy, and a will to resist as sharp and unyielding as iron. That truth was too dangerous to print, too destabilizing to allow into polite conversation. And so, predictably, her name never appeared in Savannah's newspapers. Not a single headline dared to whisper her identity. The presses instead spoke of a tragic misfortune that had befallen a noble family, invoking illness, fate, or the inscrutable hand of God, rather than the possibility of human rebellion. The pulpits, too, fell silent. These were the very same churches that thundered week after week with sermons about obedience, divine hierarchy, and the sanctity of social order. Yet when the Whitmores fell, those pulpits quivered with unease. Not one preacher stood before his congregation and admitted that an enslaved woman had shattered Savannah's illusion of control with nothing more than her knowledge of herbs and the patience of her hand. Instead, the Whitmores were mourned publicly as victims of God's unknowable will. Their reputations were polished to gleam brighter than before, while Sarah was erased, consigned to rumor and shadow. Silence became the city's strategy, its chosen balm for maintaining the Aisha's illusion of order. And yet, here lies the haunting irony. That very silence gave Sarah a form of immortality the Whitmores themselves could never command. In the hush of night, when fires burned low and children leaned into their mothers' laps, her name was spoken softly, in whispered songs, in fragments of prayer, in stories passed from mother to daughter. Her defiance endured. She became not a ghost to fear, but a symbol of possibility. The cook in Savannah, who had reclaimed her voice with a spoonful of sugar, who transformed tools of servitude into instruments of revenge. The city buried her in silence, but that silence became the vessel through which she lived on, stronger than ink, stronger than stone. Sarah survived where the Whitmores did not, in memory, in legend, in defiance too dangerous ever to be written down. Sarah herself dissolved from the written record, as though history had conspired to erase the most dangerous figure it had ever accidentally produced. What became of her remains one of those unsolvable mysteries, the kind no archive can answer, only rumor can sustain. Some claim she was hanged quietly in the square at dawn, the execution staged before a small circle of chosen witnesses. No announcements, no proclamations, no entry in the city's official ledger, because to acknowledge the rebellion of a cook would be to acknowledge the cracks in Savannah's glittering facade. According to whispers, her body swung silently in the gray morning light while the rest of the city still slept. The gallows dismantled before the first carriages clattered across the cobblestones. The lesson was meant to be buried as deeply as her corpse. Yet other voices insist the story ended differently. They imagine Sarah slipping into the night itself, aided by Josiah's whispered network of sympathizers. They see her feet sinking into the marshland, reeds brushing her legs, moonlight guiding her toward the horizon as gulls cried overhead. In this telling, she vanished into the green-black tide of fugitives who sought freedom on uncertain roads, carried northward by rumor and hope. Perhaps she reached safety, perhaps she did not. But the truth is, no one can say for certain, and perhaps that uncertainty was her final act of rebellion. A woman erased from history became a legend history could never control. Henry, the butler, whose confession came too late, lived the rest of his life in cautious, measured service, hollowed by the burden of knowing too much. He never spoke Sarah's name again, though those who worked beside him swore they sometimes found him staring into the pantry with haunted eyes, as though replaying that fatal evening in an endless loop. Lila, the maid whose memory cracked open the truth, carried the knowledge like an iron chain around her neck. She married young, bore children, and fulfilled the role expected of her, yet in quiet moments she confessed to friends that she never forgot Sarah's steady gaze, the calm of a woman who knew she was about to reshape a family's fate forever. As for Josiah, he kept preaching, though few listened. His sermons grew sharper, his voice more fiery, etching defiance into the lines of his face. And the Whitmores, they rested beneath Savannah's soil, their lineage broken, their legacy not honor, but whispers, their name remembered only as a curse murmured in kitchens long after their stone markers had begun to crumble. Now, you have to understand, Sarah's story cannot be confined to the narrow frame of vengeance alone. To think of it only as an act of personal revenge would be to flatten her into a caricature, to strip her of the very depth she fought to reclaim. What she left behind was far greater, far more enduring. It was a legacy, a jagged reminder carved into the very fabric of Savannah's memory. Even within the iron cage of slavery, the enslaved were not hollow vessels of labor, but flesh and blood human beings who thought, who planned, who grieved, and who resisted in ways both subtle and seismic. Her act forced Savannah, if only for a flickering, fragile moment, to confront the precariousness of its grand illusions, the delicate porcelain of power balanced on the raw suffering of others. The Whitmores had believed themselves untouchable, their wealth and lineage a shield forged by law and sanctified by God. Yet it took only one woman, denied every freedom, working with nothing but her knowledge of roots and powders, to pierce that shield and unravel it entirely. And here lies the part history finds so difficult to stomach. The moral of Sarah's story is unsettling, corrosive even. to the myths that keep power intact. Oppression always, without exception, breeds its own undoing. Exploitation creates the very conditions for rebellion. The same hands forced to ladle soup or polish silver can, when stripped of hope, become the hands that topple dynasties. Sarah's weapons were not cannons or muskets. They were spoons, spices, powders, and a terrifyingly calm resolve. In her steady gaze, in the composed silence with which she stirred her mixtures, we glimpse a clarity that only emerges when someone has been stripped of everything but their dignity, and who refuses, with chilling finality, to let even that last fragment be stolen without consequence. The Whitmores' downfall, tragic as it appeared to their peers, became Sarah's enduring survival. Not in newspapers, not in sermons, not in carefully polished ledgers, but in whispers, in work songs, in the unbroken chain of oral history, and perhaps that is the final revenge. For while Savannah polished its gravestones and its reputation, Sarah lived on in the imagination of those who shared her chains. Her story endures as both a warning and a truth too bitter to erase, that beneath the polished silver of every banquet table, beneath the polite toasts and sanctimonious prayers, there has always lingered the possibility of resistance. It clings to history like an aftertaste, sharp, bitter, and impossible to swallow. So I leave you with this question, one that should gnaw at the back of your mind long after this story fades from your screen. Could something like this happen today? Would we even recognize it if it did? Imagine it, an evening of joy, a wedding drenched in candlelight, a festival where the air hums with music, a feast laid out in colors too rich to ignore. Glasses raised, laughter echoing, sweetness passed from hand to hand. But what if, just beneath the sugar and spice, beneath the carefully rehearsed smiles, beneath the glow of the occasion, a hidden bitterness waits? That, my friends, is the true terror of Sarah's story. It was not cloaked in violence or chaos. It wore the costume of celebration, poison disguised as dessert, vengeance folded neatly into tradition. And that is what makes it so chilling. Because ask yourself honestly, would we see it coming if it unfolded before our very eyes? Or would we brush off the strange taste, dismiss the uneasy glance, until the damage was already done? Sarah of Savannah is little more than a ghost in the archives now. Her name does not appear in the polished ledgers. Her deeds were erased by the ink of those who feared their meaning. And yet, her shadow lingers, restless, insistent. It drifts in every whispered story of resistance that managed to slip past official silence. She is there in the half-remembered songs hummed low in kitchens, in the side glances passed across firelight, in the stubborn fragments of memory that refuse to die. She is not lost, not really. She is waiting. And if you have followed me this far, if you have walked with me through Savannah's alleys, if you've listened to the echoes others tried to smother, then you are not like most. You are one of the rare souls willing to peer into history's darkest corners, to stare into the abyss of human cruelty and human defiance without flinching. And so I ask, not as a formality, but as a genuine invitation, subscribe to Echoes of Truth. Share this story so that Sarah's name, denied its place in official history, finds its way back into living memory. Tell us where you're watching from so we can trace a map of those who dare to look where others turn away. Because this investigation does not end here. The shadows still hold countless secrets. And next time, we'll unearth another chilling tale. The unsolved mystery of the ship that vanished with an entire town's fortune locked deep in its hold. A story, I promise you, every bit as unsettling as this one.